History of the Soul War by Eddieddi. Lesson 6. Humans have their own monsters. The lecturer watched his class file in. They looked apprehensive. Several were holding custom data pads, devices only attached to the Federation network via the extranet.
I'm glad everyone got their drafts into me, though a few of you clearly only started working after I emailed you. For this lecture, we will be skipping towards the end of the Federation involvement in the war, to the 8th year when the Federation fleet was first routed.
He shook his head. The class looked at one another. The Federation fleet routed? It was unheard of. But then again, this entire series of lectures had a lot of that. They put it down to humans being impossible again. The lecturer opened the first slide. The image was of a red and orange gas giant. Around it sat a huge orbital ring. A picture-in-picture image showed that the orbital ring was some kind of shipyard.
These are the shipyards of Jupiter, the largest planet in the Sol system. When the Federation first arrived in the system, Jupiter was on the far side of the Sun to Earth, and did not appear to offer aid to the Terran forces. Thus, the Federation put them down as a neutral party. The Federation was wrong. So wrong, in fact, this could be considered the definitive reason that the Federation lost the war. These dockyards were the main source of human ships. However, when the Federation arrived, they stopped production. They appeared to be waiting and watching for whoever would win the fight. So the Federation ignored them, a live and let live attitude. So long as they didn't supply Earth forces like Mars and Luna had, then they would be left alone, expected to surrender after Earth had fallen.
He clicked onto the next slide. This was an image of a huge ship under construction. Even for a human capital ship, it was immense. A Federation cruiser could sit in its hull and still have room to maneuver.
The orbital ring did not, however, fall silent. Rather, they seemed to enact a plan that humanity had either been in the process of doing themselves, or had set up for this very instance. The orbital ring was, and still is, self-sustaining, capable of mining all it needs to produce ships from Jupiter and its surrounding moons. A human dreadnought takes a team of 100,000 humans 5 or 6 years to build. The orbital ring shipyards were capable of pumping out thousands of ships a year. Humanity had never used this capacity simply because they never needed that many ships. Rather than build a second fleet, the humans decided they would pour every resource they had into 4 ships. 4 ships.
The lecturer shook his head, as if the idea of building such a thing was insane.
An entire orbital ring of shipyards, dock workers, engineering crews, and production facilities, normally used to make entire human fleets, turned towards making 4 ships over the course of 8 years. They stripped several moons down to nothing, refining them for raw resources. They even cannibalized some parts of the orbital ring itself.
He clicked forward to the next slide. This slide showed the image of another Titanic ship being built. This one had a very different structure to the last.
The Federation, having written the orbital ring off as a non-threat, paid no attention to it, leaving Jupiter unmolested to continue its work unabated. The first the Federation knew of these ships was when they joined the battle over Earth at the midpoint of the 8th year.
He pressed a button on the controls, and what was clearly a recording of a bridge crew's conversation started to play. Admiral, we have 4 unknown ships approaching the fleet. Their path indicates their origin point was the orbital ring around the gas giant, sir.
Admiral, the humans are broadcasting on all frequencies,
came the addition from what was likely a communications officer.
Further scanning on those ships.
Put the humans through, the Admiral ordered.
I see you have decided to.
The Admiral began to speak, only to be cut off by a roar from the speakers. Whatever was being transmitted was so loud that it caused the bridge crew to emit noises of pain and discomfort.
The horsemen ride! What in the name of the council does that mean?
The captain shouted at the partly deafened crew. The recording cut off as the lecturer paused it.
The Federation has only heard those words twice. This was the first time. The second time was as a warning when a Federation military fleet accidentally crossed into the human space.
He paused as he moved to the next slide. His antenna made it clear how he felt about the level of accidentally involved. The new slide showed 4 images of strange creatures, clearly no creature that existed in this universe.
In human mythos, there are supposedly 4 legendary beings that will appear at the end of all existence. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, harbingers of the end.
He gestured at the images.
This is a depiction of them. The humans decided to name these 4 ships after those 4 legendary creatures, an apt moniker considering the size and destructive power of such a ship, let alone 4 of them.
He indicated the first image, a white warrior atop a fine steed, carrying a mighty spear.
Conquest, the domination of all things.
The next image was a mighty warrior, clad in red and black metal armor, carrying a flaming sword in one hand. The creature he rode upon was black with glowing red eyes.
War, the harbinger of destruction and violence, master of bloodshed.
The third image showed an emaciated creature with shrunken lips and blood-stained teeth, atop a mount that looked as if it had never eaten, bones showing through the skin, a pallid, sickly light in its eyes.
Pestilence, the foul rotten sickness that eats at all living things, to die from unseen foes.
Finally reaching the fourth image, this rider had no face. Astride a pale mount, skeletal fingers extended from a black robe to clutch a scythe.
Death, the end. The final and ultimate end. It is these 4 creatures that the humans named their mightiest warships after, to not only represent what they were to the humans, but to teach every other species that to inflict such heinous atrocities upon humans as the rogue elements did, was to invite the 4 horsemen of the end times down upon them.
He inclined his antenna in what passed for a sigh amongst Tricol.
The humans made their most dreaded legend manifest, and used it to fight the Federation.
He said as he moved on to the next slide. A huge ship, bulky and box-like. It was ugly and raw. There was no grace in its lines. It was unpainted, except for the highlights the color of human blood and 3 human letters painted on its side. Next to it was a silhouette of a Federation cruiser. They knew that human dreadnoughts outsized Federation main battle cruisers by 2 or 3 times, but this was insane. The cruiser was at most a tenth the size of such a titanic war machine.
This is War, the first of humanity's super capital class ships. Provided for context is a Federation cruiser. What we know about these ships is from first-hand accounts of survivors of the Soul War and black box recordings.
He pressed a button and the human super capital ship slowly started to rotate, to give the students the full image. On the front of the ship's bow was the iconography of a flaming sword, the same sword they had seen carried by the creature in the image.
All of the human super capital ships function as fleet carriers, super heavy weapon platforms, and short-range capable ships. Each ship is capable of excelling in any role in a fleet. The common features across all 4 of these ships are the spinal weapons, though each ship is unique in the spinal weapon it carries. The humans at this point had also reverse-engineered Federation shield technology, meaning that these 4 ships had shielding comparable to our own, as well as armor thicker than any we had seen before. Each ship also had several dozen armored hangars for launching various smaller void craft. War's hangars were reported to generally carry heavier ships than most, multi-crew combat shuttles, heavy bombers, and landing craft.
He paused to let the frantic note-taking of the students slow down a little.
The spinal weapon used by War appeared to be a coil gun, several dozen of them. From the battle recordings we have, it appears they are fired sequentially. Each fires a solid slug with enough velocity and power to rip a Federation cruiser apart. Federation scientists theorized it could be used to pummel a city to rubble from high orbit. War carries enough of these coil guns to never need to stop firing. Each gun has cooled down sufficiently by the time the one just before it fires. War, however, seems to only carry solid shot and explosive munitions.
He moved on to the next slide. A different ship. This one was long and flat, wide as well. It looked like a sword blade. This ship was painted in a gold and white livery. The emblem on her side, a decorated glowing spear. Human lettering along her side, probably a name.
Conquest. Unlike War, this ship carries only a single spinal-mounted weapon, the first and only relativistic speed weapon humanity had ever made. In the first engagement, it only fired twice, once in the opening volley, and once to ensure that the flagship of the Federation fleet did not survive. Her hangars generally carry all-purpose fighter bombers made for filling any role within the sphere of combat.
The class looked at each other. The theory of relativistic kinetic weapons was well known, but to put it into practice as a ship-mounted weapon was insane. If fired at a planet, it could erase all life on it. The next ship replaced Conquest. Fat and heavy, with a bifurcated bow, it looked stubby and rough around the edges. Whereas War simply looked brutal in its construction, it looked as if something had eaten away at the edges of this ship. painted in an off-white in various greens. This ship looked rotten and foul. The insignia was of a human head, skin shrunken and decayed, hollow eye sockets crying blood.
Pestilence. The spinal weapon of this ship is similar to War. However, she only has 3 coil guns. The ship makes up for that by carrying a huge collection of variable submunitions. We have seen several cluster munitions that carry nanomachines that rip apart whatever ship they hit to make more of their kind. Low-velocity munitions that deploy into loiter missiles or other such weapons. Proximity-based submunitions that explode with nuclear fire. Pestilence carries enough ways to deliver death that the Federation is confident we have not seen them all.
He looked down at his notes, reassuring himself that nothing he said was incorrect.
Unlike the prior 2 ships, Pestilence does not carry manned fighting vehicles. Rather, it carries a very large collection of combat drones. We have seen human-used drones before. However, they did not use them in void combat, as the reaction time for the human operators were delayed due to the transmission times. These drones, however, appeared to be autonomous, and rather than being armed with weapons, they would latch onto enemy ships and use laser cutting tools to rip chunks off the ship. If attacked, they would latch onto the attacker and explode.
He clicked onto the next slide, containing the final ship. Unlike the others, this ship was not decorated. Even its running lights were muted in color. Painted matte black, it seemed to defy visual definition, looking more like a hole in space than anything else. It looked like a needle or dagger, tempered to a point and sharp, no matter what angle you saw it from. Across the upper section of its bow, seeming to emerge from the shadow-filled form of the ship, was the icon, the hooded figure carrying its scythe in the skeletal hands. Something about this representation spoke to the class, carrying the weight of all mortal creatures with it. Its name was painted in bone-white color.
Death.
The lecturer broke the spell.
Almost nothing is known about this ship, its hangar contents, its sub-weapons or support capacity. Unlike its 3 brothers, it didn't engage in the fight over much, only firing its spinal weapon once.
He clicked a button, and a video started to play. The Federation fleet was in shambles. 3 Titanic warships hounded them away from Earth space, a 4th following close behind. The recording was clearly from either an escape pod or a life shuttle that was fleeing the combat. The 3 larger warships seemed to split apart, letting the black ship drift between them. The video clearly slowed down to allow the watcher to see each detail. The space between the 4 ships and the Federation fleet seemed to glitter before the film whited out, overexposed due to something. When the recording recovered, the Federation fleet had a slice taken out of it, as if some titanic blade had just come down and cut away the space the fleet inhabited. The recording ended, and the image of the warship returned.
That is the only recording we have of Death's spinal weapon firing. The only information provided by humanity when asked about it was the weapon's name, the Reaper's Scythe. Our researchers believe it is some kind of particle or directed energy weapon of such power that it is capable of vaporizing any ship caught in its blast, shield or not. The glittering was the weapon impacting on debris, space dust and the like. In theory, in deep space with no debris, there would be no way to tell the weapon had fired until it struck. The only saving grace appears to be the time it takes for the weapon to recharge or reload, as after this, Death fell back, returning to its backline support position.
The lecturer paused as he moved on to the next slide. This image was of Earth at a distance. Sitting in orbit over it were the 4 super capital class ships, a constant threat.
As far as we know, these 4 ships haven't left the Sol system since the Sol War, guarding the human's home system. In the 2 centuries since the Sol War, no species has built a warship of comparable size. Even humanity hasn't come close, the biggest of their dreadnoughts now being 50% the size of the 4 horsemen.
He closed the notes on his datapad and looked at the class.
That is all for this lecture. Class dismissed.